On December 8, 1941, Congress declared war on Japan. This signaled the official involvement of the US in World War II, hence ending the United States policy of neutrality. As the war went on, both the Allied and Axis powers suffered immense casualties. When Adolf Hitler died on April 30, 1945, the war was nearly over. So the three main world leaders of the Allied powers met together at the Potsdam Conference. The conference discussed the end of World War II and how to deal with it. It was also the first time the idea of a nuclear weapon was mentioned. Shortly after, we had the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with the bombs Little Boy and Fat Man. The nuclear bomb Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th. Shortly after, the nuclear bomb Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. This officially led the Japanese government to surrender to the Allied powers, and hence led to the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, which was defined by the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In order to combat the spread of communism, President Harry S. Truman presented his Truman Doctrine to Congress on March 12, 1947. A big part of the Truman Doctrine was the Marshall Plan, which helped stimulate the economies of European countries after World War II. Due to our commitment to the Truman Doctrine and our foreign policy, Britain decided to join the Korean War. The United States primarily supported South Korea, while the Soviet Union and China supported North Korea. Overall, the Korean War ended up being a stalemate and resulted in the 30th parallel. The 30th parallel was an armistice sign to basically end the war. However, it was not true. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched a satellite named Sputnik. This caused a lot of fear in the American public because they were afraid of what it could do. It eventually led to the creation of NASA under Eisenhower and our eventual mission to the moon under Kennedy. Additionally, tensions in the Cold War continued to lead to the U-2 incident. In the U-2 incident, a US spy plane flying over the Soviet Union was shot down. This clearly showed that the United States was spying on the Soviet Union. Just 1 year later, the United States led a failed mission called the Bay of Pigs invasion. This mission was meant to overthrow the Castro regime of Cuba. Shortly after, in 1962, the United States learned that the Soviet Union began missile shipments to Cuba. This went against the idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction, because it meant that the Soviet Union could hit the United States with nuclear weapons a lot faster than the United States could. Although the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we ever got to nuclear warfare, the Soviet Union and United States were able to negotiate a deal. The deal resulted in the Soviet Union and the United States removing a lot of their close-range missiles. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, the Vietnam War was happening. The Vietnam War was basically a conflict between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam had a communist-controlled government. Meanwhile, South Vietnam was supported by the United States. Basically, after North Vietnam had defeated the French at the fall of Dien Bien Phu, they wanted to unify all of Vietnam under one government. Meanwhile, the United States didn't want the expansion of communism. The official involvement of the United States in the Vietnam War happened because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was basically when 2 US destroyers were destroyed by Northern Vietnamese torpedoes. This led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution by Lyndon B. Johnson, which greatly escalated our involvement in the war. As time went on, however, the American public no longer supported our involvement. So under President Richard Nixon, the United States started our policy of Vietnamization. Vietnamization was basically where we taught the Southern Vietnam soldiers to basically defend themselves, because the US was no longer willing to defend them. The Pentagon Papers also heavily contributed to this decision. They were a set of secret papers released to the public, and they illustrated our involvement in the Vietnam War. Under President Richard Nixon, we underwent a period of detente. The creation of SALT I and SALT II treaties illustrated our increased cooperation with the Soviet Union. After President Ronald Reagan came in, he heavily increased military spending. He basically increased defense spending so much that the Soviet Union wasn't able to keep up. In order to attempt to keep up with these policies, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to implement the policies of perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika allowed more economic competition and provided incentive to produce goods. Meanwhile, glasnost allowed people to have more open opinions about the government. However, despite all these policies, the Soviet Union eventually ended up completely falling in 1991.